Hi everyone, it's Adam with Milo's Restoration, and today I've got a video for you. It's going to be a little bit of a how-to as well on how to restore a mid-century vintage style coffee table. So this piece I found at a thrift store, and it's just a really popular design for vintage furniture, and I started by removing the base from the tabletop. So whenever I start a piece like this, I like to think about what would be easiest to use chemical stripper on and what would be easiest just to sand. And if I have solid wood pieces, then I'm really always going to choose to sand them if as long as it's a relatively flat surface. But for more ornate details and stuff like that, it really needs to be either stripped with a soda blaster, which I'm not going to use in this video, or a chemical stripper, which that's what I'm going to use. But I just sanded the base down, the tabletop down first, and then moved on to using chemical stripper on the base. So I'm using Strippies, which is a chemical stripper that Sherwin-Williams sells. And basically, from what I can tell you about, chemical stripping, it's not my favorite thing to do either. I don't really care for it if I can avoid it, but it's just necessary sometimes. And it's kind of a frustrating process, but just really knowing the right way to do it, and really the right way is just dependent on what kind of surface you're stripping and what you're trying to remove as far as the finish goes. In this case, I just had a very thin layer at this point of conversion varnish and lacquer or whatever, and a little bit of dye stain to remove. So for this particular case, I don't need to wrap it in plastic or anything like that. It was coming off within 5 to 10 minutes, of just sitting on the surface. After about 7 minutes, I moved on and I had a Scotch Brite with some lacquer thinner in a metal pail. You know, need to put your respirator on and everything like that, eye protection, um, and gloves. And I moved on to just cleaning the finish off. Now, what I could say is that the Scotch Brite in this process is essential, because if I didn't use a Scotch Brite, I would definitely have to wait longer for the chemical strip to be work more aggressively. But because of the fact that I'm using the abrasiveness of the Scotch Brite or of the brush or whatever, it's also aiding with the lacquer thinner to remove the finish. And if you just tried to take a microfiber or something like that and wipe it off with a lacquer thinner, you would not get the same results. It would be very difficult to remove the finish just after a few minutes of the stripper being on there. But, if you wait a couple hours or, an hour and cover it with plastic, then yeah, you could probably just use a rag. But yeah, I used lacquer thinner and I used a brush and whatever just to kind of remove that first layer of finish. And what you'll see me doing is just continual washes of lacquer thinner or whatever solvent, alcohol. Um, Obviously, work in a well ventilated area when you're doing this. But yeah, just continually washing the stripper off and just getting everything neutralized. And then I'll move on to sanding the base after this is done. So this is the table after I had cleaned it a few times with lacquer thinner, and I got, I'd say, 99% of the finish off. And I'm gonna let it dry out while I go to lunch, and I'm gonna come back and sand it and stain it. And the top looks pretty good. I had to use a little bit of chemical stripper in the corners just to remove that. And before I sand everything, I want to make sure that I have any kind of dust or anything like that that might cause sanding swirls off. Also, I needed to fill a few little areas here. I just filled them with some wood filler because they were kind of in a very inconspicuous place, and I wasn't too worried about it. And I'm going to be staining this table anyway. So I kind of messed up here a little bit, and I think I made two mistakes that I probably should have not done. And if you're doing this kind of thing and you have more time, definitely take this into consideration. I kind of forgot to really hand sand the top, and you want to hand sand with the grain after you've used an orbital sander to prevent any sanding swirls from showing up. You know, you could just go to a finer grit, but what I prefer to do is to use, like, let's say that I'm orbital sanding with 220. I prefer to just hand sand with 220 to remove those sanding swirls so they don't show up in the finish. And I didn't get any swirls on the base because, I didn't really go very aggressively with the sander on it, but I did in the top, and I actually had to restain the top later. But yeah, as opposed to just moving up in grit and going up to a 3 or 400 grit where, your stain is not going to absorb very well at that point. It's going to be tough to stain a piece that you sanded that finely. So it's better to just use a hand sanding pad to remove those swirls than continually go up in grits, in my opinion. After everything was very clean and sanded well, I moved on to staining. I used the Mohawk designer stains, and I love Mohawk finishing products. They're always good quality, and I don't really have to worry about just having as many, you know, kind of questions and, why is this not working properly, stuff like that, that you will typically get with a lot of other finishing products. And yeah, it's a really, really dark stain. So what I actually did was I just tried to get stain on the whole piece, and then I took a little bit of mineral spirits and I wiped it to lighten the stain up because it was like really dark. And it's kind of hard to see on camera here, like the figure in the walnut, it basically just looks black. But after I get some finish on it, you'll see that again. And it's kind of giving it like this, kind of like that Danish style, typical mid-century piece. Um, and yeah, it's a really pretty color. I like it a lot. So I made two passes over the base, just like I did the tabletop. The first pass was just to get the color, and then the second pass was to wipe it with mineral spirits to kind of lighten the color some. The other regret I had about this was I really should have let the stain dry for longer. This is a fast dry stain, but I think that you definitely need to wait a couple hours before staining it, in my opinion. So here's the lacquer that I'm going to use, and it's good to use a vinyl sealer if you have one. I just didn't have any vinyl sealer for this particular lacquer, so I just went straight to spraying lacquer, and I'm going to add 2 ounces of blush retarder and 2 ounces of lacquer thinner, and then the rest is going to be the Linmar Ultra Lac. It's just a pre-catalyzed lacquer in satin. There's really nothing special about it. It's not my favorite choice of lacquer either. So I'm using a 3M automotive spray gun, the performance gun, and I like it a lot. It's really good for refinishing in my opinion. I like the way that you can very easily clean the spray gun and not have to worry about anything with the disposable caps and lids and liners and everything. It's just a really unique system. And you need about a 60 gallons air compressor to run a spray gun like this. Also, you need a well ventilated area with a spray gun like this because, as opposed to the HVLP turbines or some of the other spray guns that I've used, they create a lot more overspray. And you need to have a pretty good, a very clean work area. Obviously, when you're spraying lacquer, you need to make sure that you've cleaned the floors. I vacuum every day. I try to make sure that there's really no dust. That way, when you kick your extractors on, you don't pull a bunch of dust in your finish. So it looks a little streaky, and that's just because it's drying and I didn't use a sealer. But after a couple coats, it dried and it looked a lot better, I promise. So this was the second coat on the base that I did. And like I said, I had to redo the tabletop, but I'm going to show you that later. In the next clip, I'll be spraying that. So this is what should be the second coat on the tabletop, but it's actually not. Like I said, I had some pigtails in there that I had to sand out and restain the top. And I went to finish the top. I sprayed it, I think, 3 times, and I sprayed the base twice. And, I don't really know if it was the lacquer or the stain just not being completely dry yet, but it was still kind of just, it had this like streaky look to it that I've never gotten before with Precat. And I don't know if it's just that, I finished it too early after staining it, but it was supposed to be a 30-minute dry stain. But even at the time I took the video, the final video, it was still a little bit streaky. But the base dried well, and I sprayed the base before the tabletop, so I kind of knew that the tabletop was going to dry fine as well too. And if there's any questions about that, I'll post some videos after, or another picture after it's dried, just so everybody can see it. But yeah, just something to be aware of. I would definitely give it a little bit longer after staining it just to be safe. And it's better to use a vinyl sealer or a clear sealer before you put your Precat down. So I waited a little while for the table to dry up, and then I put the base back on and just attached it with the screws. I just try to put it in the same screw holes. That way I'm not, drilling into the table again. I don't have to think about, is it positioned correctly or anything. And yeah, it came out pretty good. I like the look of the table. And please subscribe to this channel if you think this kind of content was helpful for you. And I hope to provide a lot more content like this in the future. And restoration and furniture flipping is kind of what we do here. So yeah, if you're interested in that, please subscribe.